I'm Madeline Hayes, 37 years old, and during my custody trial, I was betrayed by my own mother. She's unstable, disappears in the middle of the night, can't hold down a job. Her voice echoed through a packed courtroom, right in front of my son. When my witness walked in, the entire room fell silent, and my mother's face turned pale. But before I tell you what happened next, tell me, where are you watching this video from? And if you've ever been doubted by your own family, if you've ever had to fight for justice just to reclaim yourself, don't forget to like and subscribe because the story you're about to hear isn't just mine. It might be yours too. I am a judge of the Superior Court of State C, and today, I walked into the courtroom as the defendant in a child custody dispute, no longer in my familiar judge's robe, no longer standing at a bench raised above others. Just me, a mother, sitting at the defendant's table, trying to keep my back straight as I heard my name paired with the words, unfit mother. Grant's lawyer, my ex-husband's attorney, began his opening statement to the jury with a voice as cold and contemptuous as frost. Madeline Hayes, unable to maintain stable employment, emotionally erratic, frequently disappearing from the courthouse at night without explanation. I looked up and saw my mother, Eleanor, sitting in the witness box. Her head lowered, she avoided my gaze. Her face was calm, as if she hadn't just heard those accusations. Lucas, my 7-year-old son, sat in the last row beside a social worker, his eyes wide with confusion, as if he couldn't understand why his grandmother was siding with his father, or why his mother was the one on trial. Eleanor began her testimony. She said I was frequently absent from home, too unstable to raise a child, and that Grant, the man who had once cheated and left me, was now the better choice for Lucas. I clenched my fists, said nothing. Grant smiled coldly, and his lawyer droned on. But in my mind, only memories surged back. 8 years ago, the day I was appointed to the Superior Court, I came home, placed my hand on my mother's shoulder, and simply said, I got promoted. My mother nodded, then said, I can't come. Chelsea has an important interview tomorrow. Chelsea, my younger sister, 5 years my junior, had always been the favored one. Summer camps, music classes, the compliments I never received. She never even knew I was a judge. To her, I just did some kind of legal job. I never corrected her, maybe because part of me had grown used to being overlooked. Now, with both my mother and ex-husband aligned and my son bewildered, I knew I had to stay calm. I couldn't lose anything else, especially not Lucas. I sat there, looking up at the judge's bench, where I once held the gavel, handed down rulings, listened to justice. But this time, I was just a solitary mother, and I had to fight for my truth. That morning, the trial resumed in a thick, suffocating silence, so still that the rustling of documents sounded as loud as breathing. I had arrived early, taking my place as the defendant, on the left side of the bench, where those I once sentenced now looked at me with curious eyes. My hands rested on my lap, my palms ice cold. When the court clerk announced, "Next witness, Eleanor Hayes," I felt my heartbeat drop into my stomach. My mother took the stand. She walked slowly, back straight, beige shoes tapping softly against the wooden floor. Her silver hair was neatly tied up, a light gray scarf loosely draped over her shoulders, as if she were attending a parent-teacher meeting, not testifying against her daughter in court. An old memory surfaced. I was 10 years old, the ceremony honoring top students. I stood on stage, trembling with happiness, searching for my mother in the crowd. She wasn't there? She had taken Chelsea to a music lesson. When I asked her later, she simply said, "Chelsea needed my support more. You're always good at everything." Now she was still that same mother, calm, silent, and not on my side. Grant's lawyer, Mr. Clarkson, approached the stand, his tone smooth, almost like narration rather than cross-examination. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, please confirm. You are the biological mother of the defendant, Madeline Hayes? My mother's voice rang clear, unwavering. Yes. You lived close to her recently, correct? And you helped take care of Lucas, her son? Yes. I used to take Lucas to and from school, a few days a week. During that close proximity, did you observe any issues with Madeline's stability, in terms of time or emotion? She paused for a second, then spoke slowly, as if weighing each word. Madeline often disappeared for several nights. No message left, no warning. Once, I came to pick Lucas up for school and found him sleeping with the housekeeper. She said Madeline had left the night before. I clenched my hands, my nails digging so deep into my palms they went numb. Jane, my attorney, touched my hand gently beneath the table. A wordless reminder: stay silent. Don't react. Not yet. Clarkson nodded, then turned to the jury. So would it be fair to say you didn't know where your daughter went or what she was doing during those times? My mother replied, evenly, no. She didn't share. Clarkson stepped forward, then addressed the judge. Your Honor, we request to submit into evidence several photographs provided by local residents, showing the defendant frequently leaving the courthouse at late hours. I looked up at the screen. The images appeared. Me, in a black coat, carrying a bag, leaving the courthouse parking lot around 10 p.m. Some were taken from the side, some blurry, but enough to construct a narrative, and they were ready to tell it. Clarkson's voice echoed with implication. We're not asserting the defendant has done anything illegal, but if a mother disappears for hours on end at night, leaving no trace or communication, is she truly stable enough to raise a child? I remained silent, but inside, a storm surged, anger and pain. Grant requested to speak. His voice, softer now, almost as if wounded. I lived with Madeline for nearly 10 years, and honestly, I never really knew what she did. She wouldn't say. She lived like someone with two lives. He turned to the jury, dramatic. Even when I asked, she'd just say, "You don't need to know." I looked toward Lucas, my son, sitting quietly between two social workers in the back row. His face was confused. His wide eyes looked at me, as if trying to read something in my face to believe in. He didn't cry, but his lips were pressed tight, as if he feared that if he spoke, the world would collapse. A former colleague of Grant also testified, his tone casual, as if sharing anecdotes. I saw Grant take Lucas to school, pick him up, cook for him. I never saw Madeline at home during those times. Jane glanced at me, quietly taking notes. My mother at the witness stand did not object, only nodded slightly, as if these words confirmed what she had believed all along. I did not react. Jane whispered, "Let them talk. Our turn will come." I nodded faintly, though my throat burned and my palms bore deep imprints of my nails. When Judge Patricia called a recess, I stood like a machine. Outside the courtroom, camera shutters clicked. A reporter whispered to another, "Heard she's a judge. But no one's ever seen her rule." I didn't look back, didn't explain, didn't look at my mother or Grant. I walked out of the court, past every pitiful and judging gaze, because I knew this battle they had just won a round, but the war was not over, and I had not said my last word. That night, I didn't go home right after court. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets of Pasadena, directionless, as if by not stopping, what had just happened in that courtroom wouldn't be real. But everything had happened. Right in front of me, right in front of Lucas. I turned on the car radio, trying to distract myself, but then a news segment froze me in place. A custody case drawing attention in Los Angeles County, where a woman believed to work in the legal field is being accused by her ex-husband of emotional instability, unexplained absences, and neglect toward her young son. Notably, the woman's own mother testified against her this morning, stating, The father would be a better caretaker. I turned the radio off, my hands on the steering wheel, but the strength gone. I leaned my head back against the seat, feeling like someone had just tightened an invisible cord around my throat. No one mentioned my name, but everyone in that courtroom this morning would know. Acquaintances, old colleagues, courthouse staff, those who once greeted me with respect, were probably listening now, wondering who is Madeline Hayes, really. My phone buzzed. A message from Lisa, a former colleague from the Court of Appeals. I don't know what's happening, but if you need someone to talk to, I'm here. I stared at that sentence for a long time, then replied, I'm fine. When I got home, it was 9 p.m. The small apartment was pitch dark, unusually cold. I turned on the light, took off my shoes, then sat down on the floor, on the gray carpet where Lucas once lay drawing comics. On the shelf was still the photo of the two of us, taken in Sequoia 2 years ago. I was beaming in that photo. But now I wasn't sure that woman still lived inside me. I had stayed silent too long. Thought of silence as a professional virtue, as dignity. But now I realized, sometimes silence lets others write a story that isn't yours. I stood up, poured a glass of water, then opened my laptop. Each keystroke echoed like a gavel pounding against my chest. I opened my old contacts, typed, Elijah Reed. 3 years ago, I had helped Elijah, an independent private. 3 days passed quickly, and that afternoon, when I stepped into Elijah's small office in Culver City, a light rain was falling. Raindrops tapped softly against the dusty glass windows, as if the weather was tense on my behalf. Elijah was already waiting, sleeves rolled, holding a thick file, his face betraying a heavy seriousness. After I sat down, he carefully placed the file on the desk. Madeline, I found some things, and they're not simple. I looked at him. Where do we start? Elijah opened the first page. It was an image of a minor accident. Grant's car, front end crushed, next to a broken streetlight. This happened 4 months ago. Grant left the scene before the police arrived. No one pressed charges because the police received a settlement in advance. I obtained the original report. It clearly states, suspected drunk driving. I nodded slightly. What else? He turned to the next page. A bank statement belonging to my mother, Eleanor. In the last 4 months, there were 3 regular transfers, each around $6,000, from a company named Hayes Consulting, LLC. Legal representative, Grant Whitman. He created a shell company and funneled money to your mother under the label Family Consulting Fees, totaling nearly $18,000, right when the custody suit started. I straightened. The next page was a 1-minute audio recording. Elijah pressed play. Voices came through, chillingly clear. Chelsea whispered, as long as she loses custody, I think she'll back off everything. Grant chuckled dryly. Just keep your mother on our side. I froze. My heart didn't race. It felt crushed. I was prepared for disappointment, but I hadn't expected it to run this deep. Elijah turned to the final page. A debt notice. Eleanor once owed $43,000 in online gambling. 1 month after Grant started transferring money, the debt was paid in full. I closed the file and left Elijah's office, but I didn't go home. I drove to the house I once believed was safe. Eleanor was trimming lavender in the yard. She looked up, unsurprised. Madeline, you came unannounced? I didn't respond. Chelsea, sitting inside, stood quickly, still holding her phone. I placed the file on the coffee table, slowly, decisively. I won't ask how you felt siding with Grant. I just want you to look at this and explain. Eleanor picked it up. When she reached the bank statements, her hands trembled. Chelsea stepped forward. Madeline, it's not what you think. I cut her off. Calm voice, sharp as a blade. Not what I think. Then explain. Why did Grant send money to Mom? And why did you, Chelsea, tell him I needed to be pushed to the edge to back down? Eleanor set the file down, avoiding my eyes. I just thought... Grant would give Lucas a more normal life, less stress. You're always busy. You never tell anyone anything. I laughed, not out of humor, but understanding. This wasn't a family. It was an alliance. You told me silence was wise. I obeyed. You told me to step back for Chelsea. I did. And now you've used that silence and restraint to twist the truth in court. Eleanor looked up. For the first time, her eyes met mine. She whispered, "I just wanted peace." I replied, soft but cold, "There is no peace when the truth is distorted." Chelsea jumped in, voice urgent. "Madeline, I was just scared Mom would break. I didn't think Grant would use it all against you. I just thought you wouldn't go this far." I looked at my sister, the one who took my scholarship, who smirked at my wedding news. I forgave. I moved on, until they repeated it. "You've always feared my success. Not because you hate me, but because you can't bear others seeing me clearer than they see you. But that gives you no right to betray me." Chelsea bit her lip. No response. I turned to my mother. "I just want the truth. No excuses, no blame. Just one answer. Did you take money from Grant to side with him?" Eleanor said nothing, her face void of expression. Just a small, weary nod. I stood up, my voice firm, my hands steady. "That's enough. This family chose Grant over me. And from now on, I have nothing left to hold on to here." Chelsea looked like she wanted to speak, but I was already at the door. In the car, I made a call. The line rang. I spoke, no longer afraid. "Judge Harold? This is Madeline Hayes. I need you to be a witness. I know there's risk, but I'm not asking for favors. I just need a chance for the truth to be spoken properly." There was silence. Then Harold said, "I always believed you were one of the most principled judges I ever mentored. If now is when you need that belief proven, I'll be there." I hung up. Wind rustled the trees. I didn't cry. But I knew. I had just severed something that had long been choking me. Justice doesn't begin in the courtroom. It begins the moment we dare to name our pain. 2 weeks after the confrontation at my mother's house, I returned to the courtroom. The second hearing began at 9 a.m. The rain was light that morning, but the air in the courtroom was heavier than ever. I sat alone at the petitioner's table. Across from me was Grant, well-groomed, wearing a practiced smile, but his hands trembled slightly as he flipped through his notes. Behind him sat my mother, Eleanor, and my sister, Chelsea. I no longer felt anger, just clarity. I was facing an alliance built on manipulation. Judge Harper glanced at the file, tapped the gavel lightly. "We'll proceed with the hearing. Today, the respondent, Ms. Madeline Hayes, has requested to present additional witnesses. The first is retired federal judge, Mr. Arthur Harold." The courtroom buzzed. Grant jerked his head toward his lawyer. Eleanor leaned back. Chelsea bowed her head. Harold entered, tall, in a dark gray suit, wearing a judicial insignia. His eyes scanned the room before resting on me. That gaze, unbiased, but filled with recognition. My attorney, Ms. Peterson, stepped forward. "Judge Harold, can you confirm your professional relationship with Ms. Madeline Hayes?" Harold nodded, voice calm and resonant. "I was formerly the senior advisor to the Superior Court of State C. Madeline Hayes was one of the youngest judges I ever recommended. I didn't do it out of favoritism, but because of her competence and professional integrity." Grant's attorney rose, tone sharp. "Judge Harold, are you not biased in this case? Doesn't your past recommendation compromise your objectivity?" Harold didn't flinch. "Mr. Whitman, I'm not testifying for Madeline Hayes as an individual. I'm testifying to what I witnessed in my 13 years of service, a woman who dedicated her entire career to protecting children and the vulnerable. And now, she is the one placed in that vulnerable position." The courtroom stirred again. I sat still. My hands gripped the table tighter. Ms. Peterson continued, Judge Harold, have you met Lucas Hayes? Yes, I met him when he accompanied his mother to a judicial seminar on children's rights. He was cheerful, articulate, and clearly felt safe and connected to his mother. Then why do you believe Ms. Hayes is a fit mother? Harold turned to the judge. Because I've seen hundreds of parents enter this courtroom, grieving, torn, focused solely on their pain. But Madeline Hayes, she's the only one I've ever seen who once declined a promotion so she could have more time for her son. That, to me, says everything. Grant stood abruptly. Objection. That's personal speculation, without legal basis. Judge Harper raised a hand. Objection noted, but the testimony is allowed as character and professional ethics evidence. Ms. Peterson nodded. Thank you, Judge Harold. No further questions. Harold stepped down. As he passed me, he paused and said softly, only for me to hear. Don't let them define you by betrayal. The truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to stand tall. I gave a slight nod. Next witness. Ms. Peterson called. Next, Private Investigator Elijah Cross. Grant nearly dropped his pen. I looked at him. His eyes no longer carried confidence. They carried fear. Elijah stepped up, voice steady. I was hired by Ms. Madeline Hayes to investigate actions that may impact her son's welfare, specifically concerning Mr. Grant Whitman. And what did you discover? Elijah opened a file. Evidence of Mr. Grant being involved in a drunk driving accident. The matter was hushed through an off-record settlement. Additionally, I discovered Mr. Grant created a shell company to funnel $18,000 to Ms. Eleanor Hayes, Ms. Madeline's mother, during the custody proceedings, under the guise of family consulting fees. Judge Harper frowned. Do you have physical evidence of these transactions? Elijah nodded. Yes. These are the bank statements and company documents. The evidence was submitted. The room fell into stifling silence. Ms. Peterson concluded, Your Honor, we submit this evidence to demonstrate signs of collusion, tampering with witness neutrality, and steering the trial against Ms. Hayes. It also reveals Mr. Grant's past recklessness and dishonesty during litigation. Judge Harper nodded. We will review thoroughly. The hearing is adjourned while an independent panel evaluates the evidence. Final judgment will be issued at next week's conclusion. I took a slow breath. Not a victory. But for the first time, the scale had shifted to center. I looked back. Chelsea had risen, face pale. Eleanor sat in silence, head bowed. And Grant had nothing left to grasp. That night, I drove home slowly. The rain hadn't fully stopped, but the roads were dry. The city of Los Angeles shimmered like a map lit by hope, though I wasn't sure anymore if I still had a place in it. Lucas was sleeping at Aunt Alyssa's, the only close friend who had stayed by my side after the divorce. I stood barefoot in the empty living room, having slipped off my heels, my feet brushing against the cold wooden floor. Harold's words echoed in my mind. Truth doesn't need to be shouted, it just needs to stand tall. But how do you keep standing tall when your own mother and sister chose money and ambition over believing you? My phone buzzed. A message from Elijah. Judge Harper has requested an independent review of all the evidence. I'm keeping close. I typed back, Thank you. Without you, I wouldn't have had the courage to face today. Elijah replied with a smiling emoji, followed by, You're stronger than you think, Madeline. I turned off the phone. The kitchen light illuminated a photo on the wall, me and Lucas at Griffith Park 2 years ago. I was holding him, his eyes shut, asleep on my shoulder. That moment, so small, yet it meant everything. I walked into the bedroom and opened my laptop. On the desk lay a file I still hadn't sent, the petition for an internal investigation into the county court's potential conflict of interest and Grant's abuse of influence. I hesitated. If I sent this, I wouldn't just be a mother fighting for custody. I'd be the one exposing corruption in the very institution I had once served. Would they call me a traitor? Or the last person willing to speak the truth? I opened another document, my father's old will. I had found a copy in a dusty file my mother kept. One strange detail: I wasn't mentioned. The estate was split between Eleanor and Chelsea. No explanation. No footnote. As if I had never existed. I made a call. She answered after 3 rings. Mom. Silence. You knew Dad left everything to you and Chelsea, but did you know that wasn't the final version? Eleanor sighed. Madeline, it's in the past. Your father had his reasons. I pressed. Or was it because you buried the original to protect your share? My mother didn't answer. Just heavy breathing. I continued. I forgave you when you sided with Grant. But if you stay silent now, I won't forgive again. Not just for me, but for Lucas. I will not let a child grow up in a world where truth is buried beneath money and manipulation. Eleanor's voice finally shook. What do you want from me? I replied slowly. This time, I don't need you to do anything. I just need you to know. I no longer need you to define my worth. I ended the call. My breath was heavy, but my chest felt lighter. Then I opened my email, attached the investigation file, and hit send to the State Judiciary Ethics Council of C. When the sent successfully message appeared, I realized something. I might lose my reputation, my friends, even my job. But I would still have one thing: myself. In the quiet apartment, the sound of rain outside the window faded. I looked out, and for the first time, I didn't feel alone. 3 days before the final ruling, I received a call from Clara Nguyen, a former colleague, now an investigative reporter at the Los Angeles Journal. Her voice was tight, like a drawn wire. Madeline, I need to give you a heads up. An anonymous memo was sent to the editorial office, alleging that you were once internally disciplined for postpartum depression, that you abandoned court duties and have a history of instability. The sender, Grant Whitman, under the guise of an internal source from the court. They haven't published it yet, but if a smaller outlet runs it first, your career might not survive. I froze in my office. The photos on the wall, Lucas as a baby, me and my grandfather on the day of my first oath, suddenly felt like evidence of everything I was about to lose. I whispered. I kept quiet, so Mom and Chelsea wouldn't get dragged into this. And this is what they choose? Clara was silent for a moment, then said softly, This isn't the time for grace, Beck. If you don't speak up, they'll define you by the very things you fought to keep private. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed every meeting, every email, every time I declined a night out just to finish court files on time. I remembered the night Lucas was born, how I had to undergo a C-section alone because Grant was too exhausted from a work trip. I remembered our mornings I held Lucas while feeding him, editing rulings and trying not to let anyone see my trembling hands. I used to believe silence was wisdom, but now that silence was being weaponized against me. The next morning, I called Clara back. Let's do the interview, but no sensationalism, no attacking anyone. I'll only speak the truth. The interview took place in a small borrowed studio. No stage lights, no crew. Just a recorder, a microphone, and me, in a charcoal gray suit that nearly matched the weariness of my skin. Clara asked, Why are you choosing to speak up now? I answered without hesitation, because I used to believe that family matters should stay private. I stayed silent to avoid hurting anyone, but now they're using that silence to twist the truth. So this is no longer personal. This is about the system, a system where women are taught. If you want peace, stay quiet. Have you ever made mistakes? Clara asked. I nodded. I used to think I could balance everything, being a mother, a wife, a judge. I thought, If I sacrificed enough, people would understand. But I was wrong. People don't understand when it doesn't benefit them. The interview was published under the headline, Loyalty or Truth, when a female judge stands between justice and bloodlines. Within hours, social media erupted. Many criticized me for using the media to pressure the court, but there were also comments that felt like compasses in the storm. You're not alone. Your story is also my mother's story. Silence doesn't save anyone. Thank you for speaking out. 2 days later, on the eve of the verdict, I received a call from Chief Judge Harold. His voice was nearly unchanged from the first time I heard him lecture at UCLA Law. Deep, slow, and never one to waste words. Madeline, I read the interview. I used to worry you'd break, under pressures men never have to face. But now, I see you, standing tall. I didn't respond right away, because something I had never dared to believe was now clear in the sound of his voice. I no longer had to endure this darkness alone. Tomorrow is the verdict. But tonight, I don't tremble. I don't cry. I simply sit, writing the final lines in my journal. Truth doesn't save us from pain, but it's the only thing that lets us move forward, without bowing our heads. The courtroom that day was dead silent. The October wind slipped through the frosted window panes, as if trying to slip in the words no one dared to say aloud. I sat alone at the petitioner's table, while across from me was Grant, white shirt, pale blue tie, playing the part of the perfect father. My mother, Eleanor, did not show up. Chelsea sat beside Grant, occasionally glancing at me, her eyes a blur between guilt and defense. But I no longer waited for anyone to stand by me. My lawyer, Ms. Castillo, opened by submitting a new audio recording. She said, "We present this as evidence of collusion intended to manipulate the outcome of the custody case." The judge nodded. The file was handed over. I looked directly at Grant. He didn't flinch, didn't blink, still convinced he was in control. The audio played in the stillness. Chelsea's voice, light and tense. "As long as she loses custody, I think she'll back off everything." Then Grant's low chuckle. "Just keep your mother on our side." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Someone behind me whispered, "Oh God." I didn't turn around, but I knew, sitting in the back row, was Judge Harold. He had already submitted a legal certification confirming the evidence Elijah gathered, and today, he came not as an official witness, but as someone ready to speak if justice needed a voice with weight. The judge stopped the recording. His face was cold, but he didn't hide his anger. He asked Grant to stand. "Do you have an explanation for this conversation?" Grant cleared his throat, glancing at Chelsea with a look of blame. "It was a private exchange between me and my sister-in-law. I had no intention of harming anyone." "And what about the money transfers to the petitioner's mother and the drunk driving incident that was quietly resolved to avoid charges? Would you like to clarify those?" For the first time, Grant's expression changed, but his attorney quickly stood, objecting to the inclusion of irrelevant information. Ms. Castillo stepped forward, her voice even and firm. "Your Honor, these money transfers, conducted through a shell company legally represented by the defendant, coincided precisely with the time the petitioner's mother altered her testimony. This is not coincidence." She held up a folder. "And here, a certification from Judge Harold confirming the legality of the evidence collection process." Harold stood then. He did not approach the stand. He simply nodded and spoke from the gallery. "I have verified the legitimacy of the audio and the investigation process. All evidence was collected in accordance with the law." The judge nodded. The entire courtroom was silent. Then he turned to me. "Ms. Hayes, do you wish to say anything before I make my ruling?" I stood. My voice did not shake. I didn't look at Grant. I looked forward, to no familiar face, but to where justice waited. I am not a perfect mother. I've overworked. I've kept my pain to myself. But I have never, not once, abandoned my son. And I believe anyone who has ever loved a child knows that a child does not need a pretend father or a home full of secrets. He needs the truth. I paused, then spoke slowly. And today, I choose the truth. The judge nodded. He bowed his head slightly, as if weighing the decision one last time. Then he spoke. Based on the new evidence, and the defendant's dishonest conduct, the court rules, full custody is awarded to the petitioner, Ms. Madeline Hayes. The defendant, Grant Whitman, is barred from contact for 6 months, and thereafter, visitation shall only occur under professional supervision. A sob came from the other side of the room. Chelsea lowered her head. Grant struck the armrest lightly, but said nothing. I sat back down, not with triumph, but with a quiet emptiness inside, as if, after everything, what I needed was not victory, but the sense that I no longer lived in someone else's shadow. When the session ended, I stepped into the hallway, the air still cold. Elijah stood there saying nothing, only nodding. I smiled, for the first time in days, because perhaps the cruelest thing isn't being betrayed but being forced to stay silent, and today I had stayed silent no longer. That evening, I brought Lucas home, the glow of the streetlights casting a quiet welcome across the windows. Lucas had fallen asleep in the car. I watched him through the rearview mirror, his round cheeks soft in sleep, one hand still clutching his stuffed dinosaur, and I realized this was the first time I was bringing my son home, in peace. No more fear that Grant would show up unannounced. No more controlling texts, accusations, or the wary glances from my own mother. I carried Lucas in, his little legs dangling, head resting on my shoulder like a silent act of forgiveness. After laying him in bed, I sat beside him for a while, watching him. I whispered, "We don't need anyone else, do we?" But inside me there was still an emptiness, not because of Grant, but because of my mother. I sat at my laptop, reopened the file on our old house in Pasadena, the place I grew up, where she used to bake apple pies on Sunday afternoons. I knew, even though she remained silent during the second trial, I still needed a conversation, not to reclaim affection, but to close a door that had been left open too long. The next morning, I sent her an email. No blame, just a few lines. "If you're willing, I'd like to see you, not as lawyer and mother, not as judge and daughter, but as 2 women who once knew how to love, and once knew how to be wrong." She didn't reply. But 3 days later, a package arrived. Inside was a handwritten letter, her script still firm. "Madeline, I couldn't bring myself to go to court. I didn't have the courage to face you. I once believed Grant was the ideal man, the kind of man I hoped you'd have. And when you resisted him, I thought you were destroying everything. But I was wrong. I have no excuse. Only one wish, that the wound I caused doesn't become a wall between you and love. Mom, Eleanor." I didn't cry. I placed the letter in a wooden box, the one where I keep things that only time can help me forgive. And I understood. Forgiveness isn't to set others free. It's to make our own burden lighter. Around that time, Elijah's subplot quietly opened its own chapter. He sent me a photo, the cover page of an old case file he had once investigated. It was a case involving his father's company, one that had covered up multiple acts of corruption. Somehow, Elijah was preparing to reopen it. I asked him, "Why now?" He simply answered, "Because if you had the courage to confront your own blood, then I have no reason left to stay silent." I smiled, softly, because I understood. Courage, at its best, is contagious. That evening, Lucas and I sat eating pizza. He pointed at the orange juice box and said, "Mom, let's bring juice for my teacher tomorrow. She coughs a lot." I nodded. a warm feeling rising in me. A child raised in love will know how to care for others. And I thought, maybe, just maybe, I had done something right. Monday morning. I returned to the courthouse, not as a defendant nor a witness, but as part of a closed-door meeting among state-level judges. A confidential session had been called to review Grant's misconduct, abuse of power, witness manipulation, and setting up shell companies to funnel bribes. And I, though no longer his wife, remained one of the directly affected parties. When I entered the room, about 8 people were present, including Chief Judge Elridge and 2 representatives from the Judicial Review Board. Grant was not there, but copies of testimonies, audio recordings, and financial evidence were laid out on the table. What I once believed existed only in the shadows was now out in the light. "I don't want Grant to be punished out of personal vengeance," I said, my gaze unwavering. "But I believe, if the system doesn't have the courage to name wrongdoing, then those hurt by it will never feel safe." Judge Elridge nodded thoughtfully. "You'll be notified when a decision is made." I left the room, not lighter, but steadier. That afternoon, Elijah sent me a link. It was a newly published article in the Los Angeles Times about the reopening of an investigation, the Blackspire Investment Fund, where Elijah's father had once served as CEO, was accused of laundering money through fake relocation projects in Nevada. What stood out was this: the whistleblower who reignited the case was Elijah Hayes. I called Elijah. He was at his office, his face tense yet glowing in the late afternoon light. "Are you sure?" I asked. "As sure as you were when you stood up for Lucas," he replied without hesitation. I knew then, we were both breaking free of invisible chains. For me, it was the cycle of family, expectations, and the fear of being left behind. For Elijah, it was the glittering facade of a powerful family, where wrongdoing was hidden behind prestige. And somehow, we were both learning how to walk toward the light without asking for permission. That evening, as I read to Lucas before bed, he asked, "Mom, are you sad because Dad didn't love you?" I paused, then answered slowly, "Yes, I am. But I'm not sad because I was hated. I'm sad because I once believed." Lucas nodded and placed his hand on mine. "But now you have me. And your friend, Elijah. That's a lot." I laughed. "Yes, that's a lot." That seemingly innocent statement was the clearest reflection of what I needed to remember. Family isn't defined by blood, but by who stays when you're hurting the most. And I knew the light I was walking into didn't come from a courtroom. It came from the choice not to back down, even when the whole world once turned away. The next morning, my attorney, Ms. Elaine Monroe, placed a file in front of me, its title printed in bold, "Final Custody and Asset Agreement." She looked at me with respect in her eyes. "Madeline, this is your chance to reclaim the house, the car, and even the joint investments with Grant." With Elijah's evidence, Judge Harold's testimony, and the Judicial Board's findings, Grant has agreed to negotiate. I flipped through the pages. Every term was in my favor. Grant had all but lost his credibility, his public standing, even his career in prosecution. But one clause made me pause for a long time. Item number 9. Madeline Hayes agrees to withdraw the request for criminal investigation against Grant Whitman on the condition that he forfeits all custody and financial rights related to Lucas. Elaine added gently, "You don't have to sign now. But I think this is the moment to ask yourself, what kind of justice are you truly after? Retribution or release?" I didn't answer right away. I left her office and drove to the park near home. It was the place I used to bring Lucas when he was still learning to walk. The old bench, the maple tree shading the path, they were all still there. But the woman sitting here now was no longer a scared mother humiliated by her husband, nor a daughter desperate for her mother's belief. I sat down. The March breeze played with my hair, carrying the soft scent of milkwood blossoms. I took out my phone and called Grant. He didn't expect it. "Madeline?" His voice was hoarse and low, like someone who hadn't slept in days. "You'll have your freedom, but never come near my son again." I never meant to hurt the boy," Grant replied hesitantly. But you hurt what he believes, by teaching him that bending the truth is acceptable if the reason feels justified. I won't let him learn that." He went silent. No apology. No excuses. Just a faint sigh. And he hung up. I returned to Elaine's office and signed the documents. Each stroke of the pen felt like a cut, not against Grant, but severing the expectations I had clung to, that justice had to mean victory in battle. But I realized some victories don't come from reclaiming, they come from choosing what not to carry. That afternoon, Lucas and I went for a walk. He beamed as he jumped into a puddle. I didn't scold him, didn't tell him to stop. I just watched, like it was the first time I truly saw. This child doesn't need the right life I once imagined. He needs a whole one. I understood then. I didn't need to defeat Grant or make my mother and Chelsea regret their choices. I only needed to stop expecting anything from them. And that is how I stepped out of the loop. Not with hatred, but with a release wide enough to let freedom begin. The week after the trial, I returned to the Superior Court of Los Angeles, not as a woman once labeled an unfit mother, but as a judge who had compelled the system to look back at itself. On my desk, there was a cream-colored envelope sealed in red from the Chief Justice. Inside was a formal letter. "Judge Madeline Hayes, in recognition of your outstanding performance and unwavering professional ethics, the Judicial Council hereby appoints you to preside over the division of complex financial and custody disputes, one of the most influential units affecting long-term rulings in the state of Siwan-Froze, not because of the recognition, but because I knew this offer had once been extended to me 2 years ago. Back then, I declined. Because I was afraid. Afraid my family would say I was neglecting my child. Afraid Chelsea and my mother would think I was chasing ambition. But now, I no longer needed anyone's permission. I no longer needed anyone's approval. I signed the letter of acceptance. And before leaving the office that day, I ran into Judge Ellen Ramirez, a woman I once thought was distant, cold, and unapproachable. She invited me into her chambers, poured me a cup of mint tea, and said, "I followed your case. You did the right thing, even when the right thing wasn't welcomed. I couldn't do that when I was younger. I once ignored a case because the whistleblower was my sister-in-law. And I've had to live with that ever since." I didn't say anything, but in her eyes I saw something familiar, the kind of anguish I once saw in the mirror, the torment of staying silent for too long. "Madeline," she continued, "I never had children. But if I did, I'd hope they'd be as brave as you were that day." I didn't expect to be moved so deeply. Not because of the compliment, but because I realized sometimes our truth becomes the key that unlocks someone else's release. When I returned to my office, I replaced the old photo frame on my desk, no longer a faded wedding picture, but a photo of Lucas and me on last year's camping trip, both of us smiling wide, holding seashells and melting ice cream. I used to think justice was for others, that it was something I upheld in court for people I'd never met. But it turns out, justice can also be reclaiming yourself, quietly, without revenge, just by standing tall and moving forward, as if you were worthy, because I am worthy. November in San Francisco brings crisp air, clear skies, and a touch of golden sunlight. I stepped onto the stage at the grand auditorium of the C-State Legal Conference, a stage I had once dreamed of standing on, but never imagined I would as someone invited to inspire. Judge Madeline Hayes, once cross-examined by her own family, now delivers the keynote address on justice and humanity in the family court system. I took a deep breath. The stage lights were soft, casting a warm glow over hundreds of faces, judges, attorneys, young law students, and people like me, who had once walked out of the shadows of their families on their own 2 feet. I began. I used to believe justice was pure logic, that if I was good enough, had enough evidence, the truth would prevail. But during my custody case, when my own mother, sister, and ex-husband testified against me, I learned sometimes justice must travel through deeply personal pain. The room was still, not a single whisper. I don't share this for sympathy, I share it because if even a judge can be manipulated by blood ties, then we must ask, how many women like me, without power, without skilled lawyers, without clear evidence, have been silenced by the assumption that family is safe? I paused for a few seconds, my gaze meeting that of a young woman in the front row. Her hands trembling slightly, lips pressed tightly together. I knew she understood. And so, I continued, justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's also about allowing the innocent to live their truth without apologizing for protecting themselves. Applause began, slow, then growing, but I didn't smile. I simply closed the folder on the podium, like closing a chapter of my life. After the talk, a group of students approached. One asked, "Ms. Hayes, after everything you've been through, what made you stay a judge?" I answered without hesitation, "Because I don't want only the loudest voices to be heard. I'm here to protect the quiet ones, even when that voice belongs to a child like my son, once turned into a weapon in a courtroom." That night, I returned home. Lucas was reading on the couch. He looked up. "Mom, are you happy?" I sat beside him, running my hand gently through his soft hair, and replied, "Yes. Because I no longer care what anyone thinks of me. That is freedom, not freedom from the law, but freedom from rejection, from a shame that was never mine to carry." And for the first time, I felt completely light in my own home. If you've watched this video all the way to the very end, I want to ask you, have you ever stayed silent just because they were family? Have you ever been told you're too sensitive just for standing up to protect yourself? Leave a comment below and tell me, where are you watching from? And if my story, Madeline's story, helped you see even a small part of yourself in it, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so the YouTube algorithm knows stories about boundaries, justice, and courage are stories worth spreading.